for those of you who don't know, this is Jemima Skala, the wonderful journalist and junior editor for Polyester Zine. If you don't know, would highly recommend Polyester Zine. It's only £3.50 and it's well worth the money. Jemima has written for The Guardian, Resident Advisor, bunch of people, and she's also a gem of a human.
For you?
So she has chosen a what could be described as basic bitch, controversial, and also like the best thing ever to talk about Murakami. For those of you who have never encountered Murakami, which I would imagine is not very many, he has a lot of books. He has a lot of books. These are all my brothers. I have actually never read any Murakami, slightly intentionally, because I obviously was aware of him, but always felt like he was never on the top of my reading list. And I did try IQ84 once and stopped. So, what made you pick Murakami?
Well, I think when I was a very precocious 12-year-old and read way above my level of comprehension just because it was something to read. So I was like always looking for like what looks cool on my parents' bookshelves. So I think I picked up the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle when I was like preteen, started reading it, and I was just like, this is so bizarre. It did not even compute with any level of understanding that I had. So that was my first encounter. And then we actually read Norwegian Wood in like September. We started like a little book group amongst our friends because we missed uni talking about books. So we like Norwegian Wood was the first book that we read and the first proper sit down Murakami experience I've had. And then after that I read a couple more of his, and I have some thoughts on him as a writer. But I love Norwegian Wood. It's like amazing. It really grabbed me.
He tends to be, there are people who I know who don't read any books and love any other books and love Murakami. Like he does have a reach and a grasp, and people love Murakami.
I understand it with Norwegian Wood because it was the one that made him a bit of a superstar in Japan. In like the late 80s when it came out or something, and I totally get that. Like it is such an imagination spinner. Like it's so tender and sweet and like so full of love and longing that of course it's sort of like very sort of easy popular lit fodder, I suppose, but with an edge of something slightly more. And then the other books of his I've read, I did go back to the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle and I read Hard-Boiled Wonderland as well. They are so like bro lit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like really like...
That is the impression I've got.
And it's just like a bit bizarre and a bit surreal and like philosophical in the way that I imagine it is like beam me up soft boy kind of way. Like I feel like I've had those conversations with a lot of men. I'm just like, I don't need to read this anymore. It's just not my bag.
Absolutely. So did you, there's quite a lot in that. So is that your opinion of his other works? So like, have you not enjoyed other works as much as you enjoyed Norwegian Wood?
Yeah, Norwegian Wood I found is, I mean, of the other two that I've read, I've really not read widely on him, but like the other two, Norwegian Wood is a bit of an exception. Like the others, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and Wind-Up Bird Chronicle are like sort of more concerned with that surrealism and that oh sorry, that was me, and that bizarre like world building element, I suppose. But I'm a sentimentalist and I really like the like relationship aspect of Norwegian Wood.
Yeah, absolutely. Who doesn't like a good romance?
Exactly.
So what are I guess how do you want to like sort of talk about these things and talk about like the thoughts you have on Murakami. Where do you want to begin?
So to bed it into Norwegian Wood, there is definitely a real, like I said, a real tenderness towards the characters and his protagonists. But I think the protagonist is not the most interesting character, which is really interesting. And he always writes, or I say always, when I say always, I mean from the other two that I've read. I'm not claiming to be a Murakami expert. But his writing or narrative perspective seems to be quite bedded in, like quite closely with his own, and it's not an interesting one, I have to say. So like the other characters and the other settings are really what make Norwegian Wood for me, whereas when he dives more into introspection in his other books, it really doesn't interest me at all, because I don't feel that like a malcontent is a very interesting narrative perspective for me to read, like personally. Like I understand why that computes with other people, but
it's common, isn't it? I recently read a book that was so full of malcontent, and it felt, I'm not sure, well, it was called Restless by Kenneth Mo, and it was just did nothing for me. Like it was just like, get it. Like the character was sort of late teens, and I was like, yeah, like, well, heard a lot of teenage boys feel like that. Like, so do
yeah. It doesn't do anything for me. Like in a similar vein, early Ian McEwan leaves me so cold, and I hate him. I just hate him. And I think that's like what the rest of Murakami is like, is it's just very introspective male persona, which means that a lot of his female characters are so like 2D. There's just like they're one thing, and they're not terribly well down.
How is the female character in Norwegian Wood?
The main female character is cast in this role of I mean, she this might spoil it for people that haven't read it, but she ends up in a sort of like a sanatorium, but like a mental hospital, essentially.
Wow, where have I come across that before?
Wow. But she's like, I didn't like, the relationship between them is so well fleshed out, and it's so complex and beautiful. But her, like, because it's written from the male perspective, she is just like sad, and that's like her one thing. And then the other female characters, like there's one of them who's just like, she's quirky, you know, she's the quirky one. And then the other one is like, actually, to be fair, there's an older female character that he sort of becomes entwined with, and she's incredibly complex and like very multifaceted. So it does vary, but like generally young women don't come off well in Murakami. It's not new.
It's not new. It's not new. It's also interesting that that can be without being stereotypical and writing everyone off in one group. It's interesting that can coincide with a big international male readership. Like those two things have happened. Like if like that being a part of Murakami's writing, and then a lot of people who I know who read Murakami, my brother, are male. You know, like I do think there's definitely a gender element at play.
I think with particularly in Hard-Boiled Wonderland, where it is so, it's just, like nothing is explained. You're really like, he asked a lot of you as a reader, which I don't mind, but the philosophical aspect, I don't know, man, it does just feel a bit like some Tinder date just being like, have you read Murakami? It's just like,
Yeah, it's like, sorry, my favourite book is Jack Kerouac's On the Road.
I did actually talk about that in my Oxford interview and I didn't get it. We moved.
Also had an Oxford interview, didn't get in, so
Cute.
Great minds.
I swear to God.
Yeah, like wouldn't have had like all the experience I had. Anyway, we digress. How does Murakami's surreal compare with other elements? Because I think it's interesting that there's a tradition of Japanese magical realism. I've read some really good short stories recently. Picnic in a Storm, Where All the Wild Ladies Are, that were like amazing magical realism in Japan. And then there are obviously a big tradition in Latin America of magical realism, and the books that seem to have been the most successful from different African countries have tended to also be particularly like your sort of segu, your multi-generational magical realism. Now, I've always been a bit like, well, I'm sure there's other things being written too, like, you know, like, let's go find it. If anyone is interested in finding more African literature in particular, there's a woman called Kinna Reads, Kinna Reads, and her blog is slightly inactive now, but she has so much back content. She's based in Ghana and she has the best recommendations. Like, it's awesome. It's such a treasure trove. Like, I couldn't believe when I stumbled across it, because I've been trying to find something that was like a list for a while. And she ran this Africa reading challenge where she was doing all these. It's fab. Anyway, so how do you think Murakami fits in with these different traditions of magical realism and all similar elements of all of them?
Yeah. Well, I can't say that I've read a lot of Japanese magical realism, and I mean, I've read obviously Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Quarantine, and I love a bit of,
Have you read House of Spirits?
Yes, I was just about to say I've obviously read all my Isabella Allende. She's amazing, my gal.
Oh, she is.
She's so good. But I don't know, because this feels sort of tending more towards dystopia, like dystopic surrealism, than a straight up magical realism, I think, because it feels quite like turned in, whereas with like 100 Years of Solitude, it's so much about like the wider spread of the family and like these tiny little branches that get picked up and then put down 2 chapters later. Like, that feels more like global, I suppose, or universal to that one society.
Also, they tend to sort of I think a predominant feature of magical realism is referring to something impossible as if it's completely normal, isn't it? Like, does Murakami do that and just sort of offhand?
Okay.
Totally.
Yeah. So there is very much a lot of things that sort of you just take for granted, because it's like, okay, I suppose, like, what was it? In Wind Up Bird, he just has to sit down a well for 3 days and someone like covers the well, so he just might die, and you're just like, cool. Like, obviously that's not very like impossible, but it's just like, it's so beyond normalcy. I think it is very grounded in the normal. Like, there's not any like, from the ones that I've read, there's not any like spirits or like undead and stuff that's quite common in others. But yeah, it's good. Like, it's definitely it's good to read. I don't know if I'd read any more Murakami, but I think I'm glad I've read it, just to have thought about it, I suppose, and expanded a bit more on what I know.
Yeah. Absolutely. Are there any other books you'd like to mention in particular? Any other translated fiction gems? Not to put you on the spot.
The other one that I was thinking about for this was Convenience Store Woman. I cannot remember who it's by.
It's by Murata. Oh, can I do this off the top of my head?
I'm gonna look it up.
Murata. I also love Convenience Store Women.
So good.
Sayaka Murata.
Yes, amazing, such a good book, so bizarre. Again, one of those, I think quite in the Murakami tradition, like just very outsiders making these bizarre choices that you just take for granted, and you're just like, oh, this is what their world is. You just like plonked in the middle of it. Loved Convenience Store Woman.
I have an interesting question I want to ask you about Convenience Store Woman. So I read it when it first came out, and I was working in a bookshop at the time, and then a colleague of mine read it sort of maybe 6 months later, and I saw she was reading it, and I was like, oh my god, I loved it, like, let's, like, what are you thinking about it? And she has autism, and she was quite like worried about the portrayal of autism in it. She didn't think it was particularly, well, obviously she should be the one voicing this opinion right now, but from what I remember of what she said, she was worried that it was too negative, too sort of othering and not realistic. I remember defending it, and I remember having a really interesting conversation with her about it, and I definitely felt that it was a really, rather than being negative, I didn't get a negative impression of it. It was just like a different way of being. So I wonder what you think about that question.
Yeah, no, I definitely I see why she would find it worrying, because I think anyone reading, because it's never specified like whether or not the main character is on the spectrum or not. So you're reading it, and I remember finishing it being like, maybe, like, I don't know, maybe she was autistic, I'm not sure, but because it's never spelled out, I think there is
beautifully never spelled out. Like, it's definitely not a question of like you need it spelled out. It's, she, you know, very much a part of it is that she just thinks in a different, whatever spectrum, we're on like spectrums, there's lots of spectrums.
I think, yeah, I do agree. I think because it was just so like uncompromising in its position, like you just were in her head, she was narrating, this is what she does, and I think because there's no other way for her, that's just you come to accept it as a reader. You're just like, this is just how it is. I think it.
So do you think that's magical realism? Because I don't think that it is entirely, but like, is that a point where sort of Murakami pivots? On the one side you have sort of Convenience Store Women, on the other side you have the more traditional magical realist tradition.
I don't know. I don't think I would class Convenience Store Women as magical realism at all, but I do think that element of, like I said, like outsiders and like inhabiting the mind of someone who thinks completely differently to how you might normally, I think that's a really strong part of Murakami. And but I think for Murakami it's more about situations, it's more situational, where he's just like placed into these completely bizarre happenings. When I say he, I mean the narrator, because it's invariably a man, but yeah, he just finds himself in these like outrageous scenarios, and there's no explanation, there's no like real seeking an answer for why. He just sort of goes along with it, which I think is like definitely an element of Convenience Store Woman as well, can definitely be traced to that.
You haven't by any chance read any of Mario Vargas Llosa books, have you?
No, I haven't.
I'd be very interested if anyone out there has. There's a book called Aunt Juliet and the Scriptwriter, and in it the sort of I only know about this because my sister told me about it, so I haven't read it myself, but in it I also read her essay on it, so I'm not like completely so in it the author is basically the main character. He's also represented in all of the other characters, and it's a really big exploration of identity. That's sort of its central theme, and it has this in it, the main character is sleeping with his aunt, and there's all this incest, and then it's really dark, patricide, violence, because it's also running along this radio novella storyline. So
clever. That's so cool.
yeah, it's it's awesome. But it's really dark, and it also really descends into sort of what is real, what is not real. Like, is there any difference between fiction and real life? Because the whole point is that I'll get to the question. I'm going to. The whole point is that sort of to write well. The main character in the book has to draw on his own work, and when he learns to do that, he becomes a better writer. And because of the parallels between the protagonist in the book and the author's own life, it really raises that question of identity. Does Murakami do that? I feel like you're kind of getting at maybe something similar.
Yeah, I would definitely say that just the inwardness of a lot of his narration and plots would strongly suggest that, I mean, he draws on his own thoughts and experiences. I don't know if you could like draw as direct a parallel from narrator to author, because I do generally think it's a little bit sketchy when critics start to do that, but I think he definitely uses himself as material for sure.
And that he raises this question of identity.
Yes. Yeah. Like, I think in Norwegian Wood, it's sort of the protagonist coming to know himself through his relationships with these three women, and what they each mean to him, and how he grows or develops or doesn't develop. And by the end, there's just this like beautiful elegiac. I don't know. Mark Commode says elegiac and it's thrown me off. But there's this, elegiac, however you say it, feeling of like a longing for a past self or a future self, like someone that you're not quite yet or have been and aren't anymore. There's definitely an exploration of self and identity through your own experience, through the author's own experience, and definitely narrative perspective as well.
Yeah. There we go. Would you recommend, like, would you tell someone to go on and, like you said, you were glad you read Murakami. Do you think that he is a would you recommend him firstly to other people, or would you tend to veer towards other books?
No, I think everyone should at least read Norwegian Wood, because it's like entry level. There's honestly something for everyone. If you like a good romance like me, if there's like deeper philosophical aspects to the story as well. I do think everyone should read Norwegian Wood, also because it's such a pillar of Japanese culture and literature. It's just interesting to read it and then think about the impact that it had post-publication, I suppose. But if you read Norwegian Wood, like, don't expect any of his other books to be in that same vein, which is a mistake that I made. I was like, I love this. The rest of them are going to be like gorgeous and beautiful and rich like this one was. And they were. I don't know if they were gorgeous and beautiful, but they were rich and dense and tightly packed with lots of different thoughts, but not in the same sort of sentimental way, I suppose, which, like, I love that. But yeah, I think they're very different. I would say go on and read at least one other after Norwegian Wood, but yeah, don't expect similar things.
I'll take you up on that advice. I'll go do my duty. What are you reading at the moment, just before we close? What are you? Yeah.
Hold on, let me look up I haven't got it next to me. Let me look up the name. Where's it gone? Sorry, this is okay. Yeah. So I had picked up. I finished a book of Kate Chopin short stories yesterday, which was incredible, and I had picked up A Room of One's Own to read, which I've not read yet. And I was like, this is the perfect time. But actually, given all of the current events and the riots happening in the US and all of the several disgusting murders of Black people that are going on by police in the US, I decided to read, it's called Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think that's how you say his name.
I've come across him. Hang on, let me Google. I've definitely come across that name before. Tell me more about it.
I think he was a journalist at The Atlantic and has written a couple of books.
No. Yes. Have you just started it?
Yeah, so I'm like 70-ish pages in, and it's just incredible. Like, it's framed as an address to his 15-year-old son. I think it came out in 2017, I'm not sure, but a couple of years ago. And yeah, it really frames, it's very theoretical and very like good on the theory of racism and the constructs of it, but relates it back to his own personal experience and brings that to a theoretical plane and the theoretical plane to the personal in just a very, very good way that makes you really like fully comprehend it, and brings the corporeal to the fore as well, which I think is, you know, you can't deny it when like 3 murders have happened by the police in the past week. But yeah, if anyone is looking to educate themselves on racism in America, I couldn't, you know, recommend a better book to start with.
I will be purchasing that as well. On a side note, A Room of One's Own is so worth the hype. I remember like when I read it, and I was just like, but this is it. Like, you know, it's not complex. Like, yeah. You know, it is just the idea that like if you're going to create art, you need the space and time to create art. Yeah. And the money to have space and time. But it's actually, I've never really gotten on with Mrs. Dalloway, or I've never loved them, but A Room of One's Own and her essays, I've got her, I have something else that I've loved of hers. Highly, I think you'll enjoy that after this.
Yeah. I'm just enjoying, like, after uni I was like, I'm going to set myself little reading modules, so like if I have several books like of the same ilk, I'll just like read them through and then like have a switch up and do something else. So I've been on recently it's been turn of the century American female writers, and now I'm on, like, that seems like a nice little hop to Virginia Woolf with my interlude of racism in the middle.
Applies to both. Was definitely still a feature then too.
I mean, these women are so, you read it and you're like, God, you're so like limited in your viewpoint.
Yeah.
And obviously, like, they all say very valuable things, but it is a very limited perspective. And it's interesting to keep that in mind, whilst also noting that they've been very seminal. But
absolutely, yeah. It's always the tension, isn't it? And there's always an expectation with seminal texts that you're getting the sort of impact that the text has had in addition to like the text itself, aren't you?
Totally. Yes, that is very well put. I don't think I've been able to word it in that way, but yeah, you're looking for like that aha moment when you read it, and sometimes you just read it and you're like, well, that was good. I enjoyed it. And that's fine. That's an okay reaction to have. To reassure myself.
Anyway, thank you so much. Like, really appreciate talking to me. No, not at all. So yeah, bye everyone.